Good morning, everyone. We are going to begin our session in just a couple of seconds, so if everyone could take their seats. My name is Alex Moreski. I'm going to be the web host for this room, so you will have me asking questions from our webinar folk and moderating the internal chat room. This session is Andrea Knoll, and it is on the art of providing spiritual counseling online. Thank you all for joining us here at eFormation.
All right. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
How are you all doing? Good. Good to see you all here. My name's Andrea Noel, and I offer spiritual direction and guidance to mostly young adults, but I've recently started offering it online. So I'm going to give you some procedures and strategies that I've used to transition from the analog world to the digital world when it comes to spiritual guidance. I want this to be interactive, so if you have questions while I'm going on, please stop me, ask me, if you need clarification on anything. So let's start off. Let's jump into it. Today we're going to have go over a little overview of spiritual direction, just the process of it. I don't want to assume that everyone knows the idea behind spiritual direction and spiritual counseling. And we're going to look at the intersection of technology and spirituality, the pros and cons of using technology for spiritual direction, and a digital spiritual direction framework, which are the components that go into offering spiritual direction or spiritual counsel online, and a digital strategy. How do you start this? How do you implement it? And what are the things you need to consider before getting this off the ground? Privacy and security is always an issue when it comes to the internet and when it comes to using online products. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then other supportive tools for spiritual direction when you decide to use an online platform. Questions and discussion will be at the end or while I'm talking. My objectives today is to look at the intersection of spiritual direction and technology, consider pros, cons, and privacy issues, and also supportive tools. What are the tools available for taking spiritual direction online? Like some of the platforms that are available, like Skype and different things like that, and developing a framework and a strategy for taking spiritual direction online. So, the art of spiritual direction. Spiritual direction is a relationship. It's also a form of prayer. It happens between two people or a group of people, and it is a conversation about everyday life and being able to be aware of God's activity in someone's life and being able to help that person respond to their life in a spiritual way. These are just some of the elements that I believe is involved in spiritual direction: companionship, hospitality, the presence between two individuals and God. It's also a discussion about faith, and it's a contemplative practice. So there is that space where you create room for silence, for deep listening. It is looking at everyday life and helping that person be able to explore their journey of life. Other aspects, it definitely is about our humanity, not just our spirituality, and looking at the relationship that we have with mystery and the divine, looking at our spiritual life in a deep way. So those are some of the elements I see in spiritual direction, and that's just kind of an overview. I'll offer you this definition by Henry Nouwen. Our God is greater than our own heart and mind, and too easily we are tempted to make our heart's desires and our mind's speculations into the will of God. Therefore, we need a guide, a director, a counselor who helps us distinguish between the voice of God and all other voices coming from our own confusion or from dark powers beyond our control. I think that's a good synopsis Henry Nouwen provided for what spiritual direction and spiritual counsel is. So now we'll move into technology and spirituality. I'm going to use the word technology to refer to online because it's more than just being online. There are a lot of other aspects for making that happen. So I'll be using the word technology more than online. Technology, this is a definition from the businessdictionary.com. This is their basic summarization of what technology is. It's the application of information to have goods and services support what people are doing in the world. That's the way I look at it. They divide it into these aspects: tangible, intangible. Tangible will be things that people use all the time, things that you can hold. Intangible will be the ideas, theories that come out of science, that come out of engineering even, and even theology. Some of the new information that we learn about our faith traditions in the past and how we apply it to today. And then you have high, intermediate, and low. High is basically, it's completely automated. There's no human interaction or very little human interaction. Intermediate, basically it's semi-automated. So people have to make the decisions for it to happen. And then very low, it's labor intensive and you really need more human interaction to have some sort of intelligence in something going through. So then I have a little definition of spirituality. To me, it's that connection that people have of something that's greater than themselves. It's also this aspect of trying to create meaning in your life and finding deeper meaning than just the everyday life. For the Christian tradition, we look at the transcendent, the personal, and the eminent. I think that our tradition shows us that God the Father is our transcendent example of the interaction of spirituality and humanity. God the Son, Jesus Christ's life, shows us that aspect of the personal, the human aspect of faith. And eminent, looking at God the Spirit for guiding us and directing us. So that's just my look on my understanding of spirituality. Now I combine the two, and you get the purposeful application of information in design, production, and utilization of goods and services to create connections to something deeper than ourselves and to support living in a more meaningful way. So that's basically using technology to develop and to encourage spirituality. That's the way I see the connections. It's that simple. So what are the tools that are available to make this happen? That's kind of what I'm gonna be looking at more. Any questions, clarifications? Y'all need me to slow down?
Who's in it?
Oh, me. that was me putting that definition together. So, so that's where I'm not sure. I did submit this information to Kyle.
It is on Pinterest.
Thank you.
You are welcome.
I also submitted some other things on there, so hopefully.
It has a lovely page. It links you to the BTS website. That's how I got there. So that's why I said Pinterest. But it has 2 links and it has a PDF of your slides.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Well,
There's also, it should have a PDF online notes thing. So I tried to create where the slides are there and you can type in your notes instead of having to write anything down. So it should be interactive there. Thank you for asking that question. Moving on. So I'm going to start with the pros and cons of using technology when it comes to spirituality and spiritual interaction. The pros, it's very accessible. Most people that have a Wi-Fi connection or even a cellular connection and the ability to download an app or interact with the website can have access to technology online, and you can use spirituality tools to for people to interface with. It's very convenient. Nowadays, you get your Wi-Fi at home and you have intermediate access to anything. Also, you have your tablets, your cell phones. That's a convenience we have. We no longer have to log a computer or have a desktop or be tied to a desk to get information. That ties into the portability. You don't need to be at home sitting down to be connected. Now, some of the cons I look at is it's kind of impersonal. It's kind of something we forget with creating relationship when we use a lot of online tools or technology. Being able to customize things for people, it's kind of hard. It's usually a platform that is just very general. So it can be impersonal. It could also be very distracting because we're connected to so many things on our phones, on our computers. We're so engaged in gathering information and taking in information. It can be very distracting. It could also be destructive, and put destructive and unsecured together in the sense that now you have people who are hacking into your email addresses or hacking into different things. People could also use it to be deceptive, to try to get stuff from you or play a role that you don't know who's behind that aspect. So those are some of the cons I see. When it comes to use it as an online tool for giving counsel, you want to have a certain amount of transparency between yourself and whomever you're giving counsel to, but you want to be able to protect that information when it goes across. So those are things that we need to consider. Moving on. The digital spiritual direction framework. The framework, I believe, helps you focus on the important elements. Now, I'm only focusing on 3. I think that those are the top 3 if you're looking at it. It's people, which is that relationship you're trying to foster. There's a process. There's a process for offering spiritual direction. And the technology. What are the tools available? How do those tools support the process? And how do those tools support the relationship between 2 or more people? Spiritual direction is about communication. And we have to find ways when we look at people to make sure that relationship is communicating the right things. I think that when you use spiritual direction online, you have to be cognizant of nothing being lost in translation. So we have to focus on that aspect. The process of spiritual direction, everybody has a specific process. There is a general idea of what spiritual direction is, but I think that we also own it and personalize it to who we are and have our personalities and our presence come out in it. You want to make sure that when you go online, you don't really lose that. You want to be able to have that person understand your presence when it comes to being online, and being able to understand that person's presence when it comes to being online. So be mindful of the process and also consider ways that technology may impact your process of being present to someone in a negative and a positive way. The final thing is technology. There are several tools available to take spiritual counsel online, not just the video conferencing platforms, but also you have chat groups you can do for group spiritual direction. You have to consider the hardware tools you need to do this online, whether it's a camera or you're using a phone or a computer. So there are different aspects of the tools you need to consider. You need to consider Wi-Fi and bandwidth. For doing video conferences, you need a certain amount of bandwidth when it comes to giving that a good projection. So those are the 3 main areas that I'll look at, and then I'm going to break that up even more. So when thinking about people, I look at what's the purpose, who's the population, how does that technology impact the population I'm trying to serve, and what other supportive tools are there. I think that purpose helps us to be focused. So be specific. What's the purpose of you taking spiritual counsel and spiritual direction online? Is it so that you can reach more people, or that you can give a little bit of convenience to those that you're working with? So create a mission statement. Create a mission statement that says exactly why you're taking it online. And also making sure that you identify what are the ways that you want spiritual counsel to be when you take it online, so that you don't lose any essence of how you offer spiritual counsel. The other thing you have to consider is your population. Who is your population of directees? Who's the population of who you serve? Because technology isn't accessible to everyone. When it comes to having the tools or the hardware, or it comes to even aspects of people knowing how to use the technology, it isn't always accessible to everyone. So you want to be concerned about who's your population, what's their accessibility, what's their understanding of technology. Do you have to create learning opportunities for the people you serve when you want to take it online? When it comes to technology, what's best? What platform is best for you to use? What technological tools are best for you to use? How can you have those tools be effective in providing spiritual counsel online? What hardware, software kinds of things you need to use? So think about that. The final thing when I'm looking at this is voice over IP, or the video conferencing tools that we have, like Skype, Google Hangouts, OVO. I have a handout on the at least 13 different types of platforms for voice over IP. But I want to encourage you that that's not the only way to give spiritual counsel online. You can use email. There are people who prefer writing letters. Spiritual guidance and spiritual counsel in our tradition in the past was done between writing letters between people. So if someone doesn't want to do video conferencing, you have the option to use email. You also want to think about social media. How could you offer spiritual counsel using social media? Putting out inspirational notes, getting people to interact on a Facebook page, even doing small groups using a Facebook page. That's also a way of doing it online. You also have, like, Google Hangouts has the aspect of doing like chat rooms. Instead of people seeing each other, you can type in the text. So there are various ways to consider when you're taking spiritual counsel online. It's not just the video conferencing. Spiritual direction, you want to think about the process. You have the face-to-face type of interaction, which, let's say, lasts 50 minutes or hour and a half for you when you do spiritual counsel one-on-one. How does that translate when you go online, and which tool you decide to use? Voice over IP, you're setting up a schedule, you're interacting with a person. You want to make sure that the process of you doing that is similar, or if not enhanced, when you take it online. You want to be able to make sure that the elements of spiritual direction stays true to the practice when you take it online. For example, I'm speaking about the contemplative aspect of it. I'm speaking about building that deeper relationship. I'm speaking about it being prayerful. You don't want the voice over IP type of interaction to be, oh, it's just a meeting or it's a psychological conference. You want it to be, it's prayerful. You want it to be, it's intimate between two people. So those are just some things to consider when you're taking spiritual direction online. So when you think about that, when you think about making sure that the process stays true to the practice, you want to think about physical space and aesthetics. If you are doing, video conferencing, what room are you using? Is it your home office? Is it in a church? Is it, you want it to be in a space that can provide some kind of sacredness. You also can use icons or lighting, candle lighting, or soft lighting to change the mood that is being projected to the person you're offering counsel to. When you're using the voice over IP, you can make a decision that they see a wider range of things, whether the camera is further away from you, they can see the room and environment behind you, or it can be more up close and personal where it's more just a face-to-face kind of thing and not a lot of background. So you want to think about how you're positioning your tools to reflect that to people. But even when you look at a Facebook page or you look at Instagram, if you use those as tools, images are a good way to create that aesthetic sacred space feel, using icons or using other imagery that helps to evoke the sacred when you're using other tools like that. looking at privacy, some of the best practices, be aware of what the platforms that are out there, what is their stance on privacy? What is their stance on security? Knowing what alert systems do they have when information is breached. Some emails will tell you, oh, you have someone who's hacked into your email. There are some email that will provide that type of information. You also want to know what protections do you have in place when using Wi-Fi. Whether it's a secured Wi-Fi connection or you're using a shared connection, that does make a difference when you look at privacy and security. Having a confidentiality form, I think, is good to make sure that you are giving the person the assurance that there's no exchange of information that's going to put them out there or anything like that. When you're using Facebook or other ways of giving spiritual counsel, making sure that you have anonymity for the people that you counsel. It's not an aspect of giving examples that are specific to a person, but being more general about spiritual counsel, spiritual direction, so that you're giving information, you're giving maybe even tools on that people can use to enhance their spiritual life.
How do you deal with, if you're my spiritual director and we have a conversation, it's ephemeral, I may remember it, but if we have a conversation online, there's essentially a digital record of it. And how do you deal with that?
So the digital record, you have the digital record if it's written by email, or I also believe there's a somewhat digital record when you're doing voice over IP. I'm not technically inclined, but I know that you have to make sure that your settings are set up a way where you're not recording a lot of that stuff. Also, clearing your cookies and history in your different applications is useful. But I definitely think that you can get more information through each platform. Each platform does have, different privacy connections to understand how do they look at privacy, how do they look at recording the things that you're doing. And like, for example, on Facebook, who's the ownership of some of the information you're putting out there. So really investigating the different technologies you decide to use and understanding how those things work and operate, I think it's the best way to try to understand what security and what insurances you have.
Do you think it impedes the conversation? I guess that's also the humanistic aspect that I'm looking at.
Repeat the questions.
Oh, I'm sorry. So do you think what impedes the...
Do you think the perception
Okay.
that there's a digital record can impede or inhibit the conversation?
Okay, so you're asking me if people worrying about whether there is a digital record of what's going on in spiritual counseling, if that would impede how people are open and how people are intimate with what they're saying? Okay. There aren't 100% assurances at all when you get on the internet. That's true. But I think being aware of what the services that you're using, how they offer services to protect information, that's your way of being able to inform the people that you are counseling the protections they have. And being able to monitor what's going on through your tools is your way of ensuring the protection of those that you counsel. If people are uncomfortable, I always usually try to do a face-to-face counsel before I start using any online tool with an individual so that I can answer all their questions, try to understand anxieties, try to ensure them that this doesn't have to be permanent. We could try it out. And if it doesn't work for you, we can think of something else. So I also try to make sure that they understand what the technology does, what are some of the limitations, what are some of the risks, and that together we work through that. And hopefully informing people more and you being more informed, it will help ease any anxieties that can arise. Does that answer the question? Cool. Any more questions? All right. Let's see. Supportive. Let's see. Well, we just talked about privacy and security a lot. So I would just basically encourage people to become aware of the tools you use and what are their privacy policies. It's always usually very much out there what a company or what a platform is using, what are their privacy policies. Maybe you can even consider coming up with a privacy policy of your own when you use online counseling, letting people know that you do the best to try to make sure their information is secure, giving them access to the different tools and telling them to also look at, the privacy policies of the tools that they're using, giving them information as the best practices. For example, I had a student who wanted to use FaceTime for a session. And when we started our session, I could hear other people in the background. So I was like, where are you? I'm in my dorm room, but there are like 5 other people in there. So I told him, I said, maybe now is not the best time to have our session because other people are around. And then sometimes you have to teach people on this aspect of having that private space and having, that creating a sacred space in their own environment. So that's something you want to teach people when they're using online tools, how to keep their own information safe. So I pretty much went over this slide with all the confidentiality and different privacy issues. Physical privacy that's a big thing. I work for the federal government and our computers. Our computers are encrypted in the federal government so that if anyone gets a hold of our computer, that information's there. You do have tools that help you encrypt things on your own personal computer. You may want to investigate what some of those are. If you have email and you're using a lot of email correspondence, make sure you log out of your email when you close your web browser instead of having an automatic login. Maybe even consider having a separate email box just for your spiritual counseling so that you don't have a lot of information in there that could be accessible or that you can accidentally send to someone else. So have these precautions to make the information more private, but you have the accessibility of using these tools to make it easier to have spiritual conversations and discussions in various ways with people.
I just had a thought.
Mm-hmm.
One of the other kind of implications of this is Windows 10 automatically turns on Cortana. And so you actually have to go into Windows 10 to turn it off, I seem to remember. And also Siri can listen to you as well. And not just for technologically, not just online. I mean, when we're talking in real life, if somebody walks into our office, we need to have those things off. Because I know Windows is collecting that information. That doesn't even, that's just in our office. That's not even the implications of doing this stuff online.
So knowing what things your tools are doing in the background is important. One of the features I just found out on my iPhone is that when you open certain apps, they don't really close when you come out of them. I didn't know that. My brother just showed me that recently. So you actually have to double click on the screen and swipe these things out of the way so they're not operating in the background. So you want to get real aware of how these things work, and reading your manuals and reading the documentation that comes with these tools is important. I've learned that the hard way. So really becoming familiar with the tools you're using, looking for experts to help you. I've gone into the Apple Store a couple of times trying to make sure, well, where did this thing actually go? Where is it saved? How is it accessed? How do I protect it? So using the experts that are out there who have more information on how to navigate security and privacy of the technological tools that we have. When I do spiritual counsel online with FaceTime or any of the voice over IPs, I try to make sure that my cell phones are off, that I'm not going to be interrupted. I also think about other people being able to hear on the outside of wherever I am. So that kind of goes into the aspect of making sure you're in a closed room, even using a noise machine outside the door so that other people aren't hearing, overhearing little, voices or what have you when you do the video. That's a good thing to do. Considering whether you're in a private or public space. I had a student who wanted to do it while they were in the library. It's not really. I'd prefer if you don't. So just really getting people to be more aware that, yes, these tools are compatible and make things convenient, but you want to see what the losses or the risks are that's associated with being so convenient. Being able to also communicate that this is a sacred time. This is a time of building intimacy with that person one-on-one. And these tools need to support that and not put it too much at risk. Supportive tools, when I mentioned that, if you decide to do spiritual counsel, with just voice over IP, I believe there's other tools like email, text messaging, social media, even blogs and newsletters can be supportive. For example, I had one student who, was kind of looking for information that could help teach him prayer practices, for example, or trying to know what information is out there to help me develop my spiritual life. And he was overwhelmed by when he did his Google search. So being aware of what things are out there online that can help guide your population into understanding their own spiritual life. I'm sure that's why we're all here at this conference, to see how these tools and where these tools are and be able to share that with the people we're working with. So like blogs, different blogs and different newsletters, you want to be able to share that with people. Using social media, there are a lot of different images you can put on social media, a lot of inspiration, you can interact with people. I did a Facebook group, a closed Facebook group with an organization I was doing work with, and we had young adults come in and they would log in, once every other week at a specific time to interact with each other. And it's all typed in, but that was a way that we had our group spiritual direction kind of check-ins in between when we actually met face to face. So that's a way to use technology to support. We had our face-to-face time, but then we had our times that we were online. So you could think of those tools as well as something you can use, not just, having that call alone. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering how you see a useful way to structure entry points for spiritual counsel through, for example, a congregation's range of social media. You understand well how to curate those one-on-one relationships, and frequently I think a general broadcast, hey, does anyone have a spiritual direct? That doesn't really get us into those deeper relationships. Mm-hmm. But if there is some venue in which there's questioning conversation, even before you arrive at the closed Facebook, about a series of steps that allows a person to go in and out of deeper relationships. Have you had any thought about the way that works through social media?
So let's say you have your Facebook page. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. How do you think about using social media or getting people to be specific about looking at spiritual counsel? How do you involve the whole congregation and it's almost like you're marketing spiritual counsel?
Usually people sort of stumble into spiritual counsel, and I want to create porous boundaries between the various media so that they can arrive at that one-on-one, but it can be in a group context as well, and it might stumble out of a more fellowship social media fun environment that leads into something deeper. Okay, so this aspect of how do you get people to find that information and be able to source it. Online, if you have a church website or if you have a Facebook page for your church, in your leadership, if you make intentional decision for spiritual counsel to be a resource for your members, there needs to be some kind of marketing strategy so that you get the word out. Whether it's through the small groups that exist already, so let's say the youth ministry or the young adult ministry or different ministries that you already have set up, and giving people the information that this is something we offer. And even getting people to understand, well, this is the different ways we offer it. So on your Facebook page, you want to be strategic in the content you're putting out all the time. So if you put out a blog or if you put out a note on Facebook, what is spiritual counsel? First educating the population on what it is, and then having them interacting with their questions that may come up when you're educating them. And you can use the social media to do that.
talking about spiritual companionship or the different elements that are part of spiritual counsel and getting that information out to people. You want to understand how your congregation uses your social media as well. Are they just on there haphazardly? Are they getting notifications about the stuff you put on? Because that's something you can tell Facebook to do. Send me notifications when somebody updates something. Are you having your social media, let's say even a social media day at your church, getting people to be interacting with it in person, at your church location? So those are just some ideas I have. Definitely bringing it to the people, bringing it to them wherever they are. Whether it's even during worship on Sunday, I think that that's something you can use. You have the audience right in front of you. Have a mention about spiritual counsel. But if you have a pastoral care program, it should be an element of that. Teaching people about pastoral care ministry, having that as a separate ministry even.
I don't want to hijack.
Mm-hmm.
The last question I'll answer is, in our congregation, we have a rather extensive student ministry program, which is a means to provide sort of congregationally based care with training to prepare for it. The question then is, what we're observing is less people entering into that program by virtue of time and commitment for relationship. So I have people trained to provide some kind of curating of care.
Mm-hmm.
My observation about social media is people find their buddies and friends that have similar like interests and create this sort of dependent relationship in that way. I'd really love to have it be something that's more spiritually informed. So I'm wondering, are you aware of any organization like Stephen Ministry or others that are already sort of thinking forward about the fact that folks aren't going to a place to go meet for coffee, but are meeting online for this counsel?
Repeating?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, I was just thinking about, so you're asking if there is a service or if there is a body of people who are able to give constructive advice on teaching these relationships and making sure that it's more organized or there are more people who have that training. One of the things I can think of are some of the professional organizations. So spiritual directors on International, for example, they people sign up to be a part of that organization. They have credentialing through them and giving people information of where you can find credentialing in whatever area you're in. For example, like Shalem Institute for Spiritual Formation, they have a spiritual guidance program. They also have databases that give you access to who are people that are credentialed. So again, I think it is educating people. This is not just a haphazard field. There are people who are credentialed. My degree from Loyola is in spiritual guidance. So let them know it's a real field, just like psychology. You don't just go and find a psychologist to treat you on the street. You do the research to find out that person's educational background, people who have gone there. So I guess trying to teach people that spiritual guidance and spiritual counsel is a real part of ministry, that people need training, people need experience, people need education, and people spend time doing that. So I think, it's really informing your population about the seriousness of, you just don't go to anyone for spiritual counsel. Ma'am, sorry.
Hang on.
I'm doing all right.
I want to specifically talk about the Stephen ministry because I've had issue. The ministry that the Lord gave me is actually online ministry. And I have been trying to help Stephen ministry to let me in. So maybe if you call too, maybe we all call Stephen ministry and be able, this is actually a specific group and they seem to be just stuck in that. You have to have the person one-on-one that I can touch you. I think it's an education, not only of individual people in the congregation, but an education of organizations. And because Stephen Ministry specifically has like almost 2,000 churches across America that provide this peer counseling in support of the pastoral counseling.
Mm-hmm.
So if anybody else would like to call Stephen Ministry, I'll make sure I give you my contact information.
So let me
They
understand.
wouldn't let me come this year.
So let me understand. So Stephen Ministry basically has a model that is just one-to-one in-person groups, but they haven't incorporated technology or online accessibility.
And I actually, went through several layers of their organization, could not get anyone to allow me to come to the leadership training this year because I kept, I was up front, I told them it was an online ministry.
Mm-hmm.
And their way of dealing with it was they never called me back.
That talks to the accessibility of the leadership of that ministry. It's an interesting thing. I haven't worked with Stephen Ministry, so I'm not very familiar with how. That's true. I mean, if people keep asking for things enough and you see the need and demand for it, maybe, that could. However, I do understand sometimes, think about Alcoholics Anonymous. That's a model that I doubt will ever be, online kind of thing. They're very concerned about people's privacy there. So you look at some of the models that are traditionally, it has to be in person, it has to be in group, face-to-face kind of thing. There are large concerns with privacy and protection when it comes to going online. Any other questions?
That's a question from our chat.
Okay.
Is spiritual direction online the same basic process online as offline, or does the media change the process? At one point, you mentioned chat rooms and small groups. Do those media make spiritual nature a different experience altogether, or spiritual direction, spiritual nurture, a different experience altogether?
To some extent, I do believe it is a different experience. It is a different feel. For example, I was in a spiritual group where we had participants that were in other countries. So there wasn't ever an aspect where we ever met in person when we first started. We eventually got to a conference and brought everybody together, which was cool. But we actually started off doing telephone calls and then finally getting to video calls. And it was a little uncomfortable to want to open up to people that you haven't personally met. But I think that you need to develop a program where you get over that barrier. And I think that having initial calls that are a little more unstructured, in the sense that you're talking to someone, getting to know them like a regular conversation versus, having that formal, you pray, silence, you offer direction, that kinds of stuff. I don't know how people have their spiritual direction organized, but being a little more casual and trying to get that person comfortable with the process online. There were aspects where I would have images available for people to see, or break off from the actual talking, show them an image and ask them what that invokes. So finding ways to interact with that person with that will help them feel comfortable, that will help them feel like you're trying to go deeper than just this conversation or lecturing session that's online. Those are some of the things that I've experienced and encountered to try to make that process not be so awkward when you start, and feel a little bit more like that face-to-face interaction you'd get. Yes.
I would say, just to follow up on that, and this is coming from hybrid learning, I think you have to be much more intentional about the little interpersonal interactions. Like when the two of us walk in a room and we're gonna have a spiritual counseling session, they're like, "Oh, you just gotta have coffee." Like those little chit chat things that don't exist online. So you have to be very intentional, and maybe like, "So what'd you have for breakfast today?" Which sounds like a silly question, but it gets people talking.
Right, definitely. So yeah, intentionality is definitely important. So like I actually have a written strategy on how to really engage the students that I work with when it comes to being online. I take a lot of notes too, after I have my spiritual direction moments, and really try to understand, okay, what happened? how did the session go? And then I also ask for feedback, asking the person that I've offered spiritual counsel, how did this feel to you? You know, what ways can we enhance this experience? What do you think you need more of? Do you need more silence? You know, do you have questions you want to ask? So definitely getting feedback from the person, because the whole online experience is a living, breathing, dynamic thing. So you have to be able to make it work for you and not just you thinking it's doing the work. Does that make any sense? Yeah. Other questions? Anyone else? So offering spiritual direction online, definitely you have to think about your process. You have to think about the tools available to you. You definitely have to think about the population that's using this technology. You think about the privacy and security concerns. And then you develop a strategy. You develop a step-by-step strategy in doing and offering spiritual direction online. Knowing what tools are there to help you, understanding what works best with your population, and being open to even talking to other spiritual directors about what they're using. SDI, the Spiritual Directors International, is a great network and a great place for resources on things like this. So definitely looking there. The American Association of Pastoral Counselors even does have information that helps with using technology when it comes to sitting one-on-one with a person. Maybe a little more psychologically driven, but you can still translate it in understanding the spiritual realm. Right? Online, I would assume, is where they have the resource of the different platforms for voice over IP. So you can have some information there. It was a website that I frequent when it comes to knowing technology, and it gives the different descriptions. But also just visiting the websites for these platforms and being aware of how they've evolved even, because like Skype has changed so much from when I first started using it. And then a last note when it comes to technology, know what your software and hardware tools, how they work. If you need more bandwidth at home when it comes to Wi-Fi or in your office, be aware of that. If your computer needs updating and all that kinds of stuff, be aware of that, because these tools get updated very regularly and you want to make sure that you're operating with the best functioning tool. Mm-hmm.
What do you find is the most difficult challenge in terms of digital spiritual direction, and how do you overcome that?
The challenge for me is not being so consumed about the online world and trying to give information and use the tools too much without forgetting the relationship. So being very aware of making sure that the tools are not just used for this process, but really built to nurture that relationship. Because sometimes when you do spiritual guidance, you're just checking off of this is another person I've done and moving on. But really staying connected with that person, with that experience, with each person that you offer spiritual guidance to using online. To me, that's the biggest challenge, is staying connected to that personal type of nurturing.
Is there some sort of written procedure for such spiritual direction?
I don't know of a procedure right now. I know that there are a couple of presentations and books out there about digital ministry, so not specifically spiritual guidance. I think SDI has, Spiritual Directors International has, I think it's a webinar on spiritual counsel or taking it online. Other than that, I'm not aware of any other resources except looking at digital ministry as a whole. And then I would think using that information and then tailoring it to spiritual counsel. That's your best access right now. Any other questions or discussion? Sir?
You mentioned that spiritual direction is, spiritual directors are highly trained people of a specific ministry.
Mhm.
Are you speaking to us as spiritual directors then, or speaking to us more broadly about how we might support the kind of spiritual life in others?
So I am speaking somewhat with the formal process of what I would call spiritual direction, what I understand as spiritual direction, because that's my training and that's my background. But I'm also speaking about supporting, doing spiritual companionship with people. So yes, there's a formal process. Yes, there's a group of us that are trained. But if you're using digital ministry, period, to reach those in your care, you're offering some sort of spiritual counsel. So there is that general aspect. That's where I think the social media and some of those other tools come in, that you're really just supporting that spiritual life overall. But with the formal process, I don't know, there are some churches that have a spiritual direction element built into their parishes, but then there are a lot of other places that offer spiritual direction as a tool. For example, when I work at Howard University with the students, we actually have spiritual directors there. Some of them are priests, some of them aren't. Some are lay, some belong to specific denominations. So that service is offered on that campus through their ministry. So there is that formal approach. It is not as well advertised as I will say. People always ask, well, you're a spiritual director, what do you do? And some people think what I do is just do retreats, but no, there is that personal one-on-one element. So I think that it needs to be out there more, the formal aspect of it, but I am talking about also generally.
This was asked a little while ago. Can you delineate a bit more, delve a bit more into why spiritual direction in a digital media is important? I think this is asked as more of a personal question. Why is it your mission to do spiritual direction in this form as opposed to the other? What are the advantages and as you see it of doing this?
So I'm not really sure the advantages and disadvantages in this sense. All I can say is the demand. I do ministry part-time. I have a full-time job. I was working with a population that they're college students. They have busy schedules. So it really was the demand for meeting with the students and finding the time that actually drove me to doing this. So it was something I kind of fell into and had to learn, how do I adapt spiritual direction to fit this population's need? So it may be an aspect of the population you serve doesn't need it. It worked out very well for me. Like students we had the Bible study. People will come to Bible study, but they were afraid to ask certain questions while they were in Bible study. They didn't want to open up in certain ways. And they would text me or email me and say, can we have some kind of interaction that is more specific to what I'm looking for? And sometimes it was over the phone. Sometimes it went to more of voice over IP where I can see the person. So I did a lot of FaceTime. But it really was my population that drove me to do it. I've become more confident and comfortable with it over time. But at first I was just like, this seems like I'm breaking all the rules. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Share a little bit more about the difference between spiritual direction as you're dealing with it and pastoral care.
Okay. So pastoral care, they're both relationships. But I think that one may be longer going and more formal. Pastoral care to me, you're also looking at a larger body of offering, care for people, but you're also looking at more specific, someone dies in the family, someone gets sick. Crisis, it's more crisis oriented. You're looking to treat some kind of issue that really brings up, whereas spiritual direction is an ongoing process. It's an ongoing relationship that looks at the entire life of the person. And, you know, it evolves and ebbs and flows what people bring to you in spiritual direction. But for the most part, it's not that crisis driven where you only pick up the phone or you only seek care when something really bad is happening. Or, yes, in pastoral care, you have a relationship that you have to develop with a person. But I would tend to believe that people go to pastoral care for, you know, events or issues. Whereas with spiritual direction, I'm trying to build a relationship that there's a rhythm to it. So I don't ever see students once. I tell students they have to commit to seeing me a few times over a length of time. So there's an intentional rhythm and an intentional way of being, I think, in spiritual direction versus pastoral care.
I'm wondering about your training in spiritual direction at the point where perhaps you've made use of images, artwork, or something like that to evoke thought and conversation. And the reason I'm asking this is that what I observe in social media is there's a lot more interest and engagement when there is a photo or an image. So I'm wondering if you've done any thinking about a way to sort of foster interest in formation by means of images.
Yeah, definitely. You're asking if I've used imagery to foster the relationship of, and specifically in spiritual direction, right? Okay, specifically in spiritual direction. So the answer is yes. The other things that I've done first that I started off doing was using imagery in retreat and group discussions and stuff like that. And I have been able to translate it to when I know the needs of my directee, I try to think about how can I create an image for them. But I also invite directees to tell me what's their image of God, give them pictures and help them to use those pictures to develop that image. It's something that they can have all the time to refer to, email them the image or have them create it. So I have used it. My other profession is I'm an artist, so a lot of the artwork I have up here is that aspect of invoking and using imagery to evoke in a person that spiritual and sacred presence. And sometimes it's just easier to use images to bring out words. You know, asking a person, what do you see? What do you feel when you see this image? How does this make you feel? Trying to find images that relate to themes of what that person is always, you know, searching about and trying to go deeper in the experiences that they share with you. So there is that background work that you do to bring to the person you're giving spiritual direction to. And imagery for me is a big part of it. Ma'am?
I'm gonna go back one question. So in your definition of spiritual direction versus pastoral care, so, and you said that you work with college age students. Did you ever not find that their life, because of the generation that the Lord has let them be born in, is not about managing crises as far as their spiritual development? In other words, I'm from Richmond, so and a couple of years ago, we had a student at in the state that was killed. Before anybody on the news could tell you who died, all of us knew that we're on Facebook.
Right, I see what you're saying.
So, you know, that generation seems to live their life throughout. So how do you marry that between a pastoral care and spiritual? Because that's a crisis. That's what it is.
And because, so the question is it spiritual direction? Is it pastoral care when you have a crisis like that? For me, it's pastoral care.
Okay.
To me, that is that crisis intervention that you need. And there are also different tools that pastoral care gives and lends to a person to know what to use when you're in that type of moment. But that could be the start of spiritual direction.
Okay.
The question could come up, you know, how do I deal with this going on? And pastoral care can turn into spiritual direction because you have that long-lasting relationship. It started off as a crisis, and now it's going on, how do I develop my spiritual life? How do I see God in the other things that are going on in my life, not just the crisis moment? So I think that it can happen in that type of mode, not just this aspect of crisis.
I also wonder if the fact that people consistently get every crisis online every 5 seconds, that relation, like that the spiritual direction is about recognizing what actually is a crisis, and what's just like your noise and everyone's talking about it online, and that linking that technology piece in is actually helpful in helping people to figure out how to manage their spiritual online life.
True. Yeah, that is a part of education. You're making the statement that how do people understand the differences and the needs that they have when it comes to their spiritual life, whether it's I need that pastoral care moment or I need to have spiritual direction. 9 times out of 10, for example, I would have a student come to me with a crisis and I'll be like, okay, it's better if you see Pastor so-and-so or Reverend so-and-so, they can help you better. Because I see the crisis aspect. Or go to the counseling center, the psychological aspect. So I've been trained to know that there are little buckets and people who are more experts in certain areas, and I guide them to that. Now I'll follow up and see if they want to build a relationship to have spiritual direction, and then I shape how that looks for them so they understand the difference. So it's my responsibility to have them educated on what is the difference, when do you need something? How do you also not make everything a crisis? I have that with my college students. They always want to call them, no, everything's not a crisis. You have to also learn to be self-soothing and self-sufficient when it comes to some of these things. So the population I have, it's kind of special. I think it's easier to do spiritual direction with more mature, seasoned folks. But their spiritual life is in a different place. So definitely the experiences I have are unique to that population, and it's a different look as you go older, with older people. So, anything else? Question?
Well, one of my questions are related to my desire to create a continuum of care within my congregation. I've done that for some time. Now I'm having to think about it online. It used to be the book, I'm okay, you're okay. Now I think it should be, I'm compulsive, you're compulsive. And it's because I think people more and more frequently turn in relationships to folks who are equally compulsive with them about whatever their thing is, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. There's a community that forms for those that are keeping that touch through that like phenomenon, which is an interesting psychological outcome. And so I find myself wanting to strategize how to get into that world of compulsivity without being so fundamentally dysfunctional to create an avenue for relationships. And do you have any insight on that?
So how to get into that world of instant information and help bring people out a little bit to recognize there are other ways of doing it? Does that kind of summarize that?
That's right. I mean, I'm sitting in a restaurant seeing a mom with young kids, and she's spending about 80% of the time on the smartphone,
right,
and 20% telling her kids to be quiet.
Right. Or to use their smartphone.
How do you retrain it into something healthier?
So within your own ministry, you have a population of folk that you have their attention. And if you're looking at the online world, for example, let's take Instagram. Instagram, you're using images. I have this thing that I do on my Instagram called Dear Me. And I usually use either some of my art or photos, and I'll post, Dear Me, life isn't so bad, or be thankful. And it's just little reminders of ways of being. Because I think that's what we get caught up in, the doing all the time. And people need to be retrained on or reminded on how to just be without the tools we have. And I have a short paragraph that explains what is even going on in my life. And so I share myself with them, people who are following me on Instagram. People comment at times. I ask questions. So trying to find ways to engage people in not this reactionary kind of behavior, but to ask the deeper questions, to think about the repercussions of being so compulsive, or to even show and reveal some of your compulsivity so that people can relate. But I always believe that it has to bring you back to a community. So, for example, when I work at Howard, the community is not just the Episcopal chaplaincy, but it's also the chapel ministry. That's the bigger umbrella that all the chaplains are under, and getting students to come out to events. So there has to be still physical interaction. You can't rely 100% on online. That's my belief. You know, there are tools that you can use. Yes, you can have a wider reach, but I don't think that we should rely on them 100%, and that we need to start drawing people to being in relationship that's deeper. Does that help? Any other questions?
So without breaking any confidentiality issue, can you give us an example of how you feel that your digital spiritual guidance program has changed someone's life? That's something positive.
Okay. So I had a student who would come to Bible study periodically, and they kind of went missing for a while, and other students who were friends of theirs encouraged them, here's Andrea's number, just text her, because I guess they knew some of the issue. So the person texted me. I was not available to be on campus for a couple of days, but I told them I can make time. We may have to do this online. How do you feel? I was FaceTiming to have this conversation. And they made the time. They were in their room. No one was there. They FaceTimed me for about 40 minutes about what they were going on. And then I invited them for this to be a regular practice. And every 3 weeks, we would have our FaceTime. And we connected on a deeper level over time. And I saw less and less of the anxieties or the spiritual struggling that the person was dealing with. They started to understand that they had their own spirituality, that it wasn't just what they inherited from their parents. And then they started opening up and practicing, that spirituality and being able to articulate it more amongst themselves, with friends, and then even to their family. So that's one instance where I saw that it made a difference over time. I had to make the time to be present to that person using the technology. So it's still having that rhythm. Even though it wasn't face-to-face, I think that there was an impact, and that person is not even there anymore. And every now and again, we'll check in using technology. So for me, the population that I also work with is very transient. So they don't stay in DC. I have a few students who wants to FaceTime over summer break when they're at home. So it gives me a little bit more access to the people that I am serving, and that I've developed relationships with. And it's made it easier for there to be continuity with relationships in a transient population. Does that answer your question? Anyone else?
I'm curious if you've heard of Talkspace.
I have, but I've never used it. I have heard of it.
I no, neither have I.
Okay.
I was curious whether or not, since it seems to be principally oriented around licensed therapy, as opposed to some of the more the non-licensed, credentialed ministry focus. I didn't know whether or not you were aware of something that was parallel to it, or that their model was getting extended or broadened at all.
Yeah, I have seen a couple of these apps pop up where you can find a counselor, more in the field of psychology, to talk to, through these apps. But I don't know of it being in the spiritual direction realm as yet.
It'd be an interesting thing in those moments where you recognize that a psychologist or a psychiatrist is the right caregiver for the person you're talking to, being able to say, and you can, you know, if you want to look at that online, there's that tool.
I actually had a student where I said, you know, you can consider that. I did.
Yeah.
And the reason why was they were just absolutely paranoid about being seen on campus, going to the counseling center. And they did not want to have that because they were so afraid of this information or anyone seeing them, because it says counseling center on the building. So I did have a student that said, maybe you can investigate how some of these therapies work on apps and over the telephone.
This is a question from me. Do you find that, or have you found that, so I've noticed a trend of trying to push back against this sort of stigma of mental health issues, and insofar as spiritual direction maybe loosely falls on the outskirts of that. Do you find that having this digital presence then aids in that process, that arc that's moving towards an acceptance of mental health? Do you see that as a positive aspect of a spiritual direction presence in an online setting?
So just looking at the aspect of spiritual direction being available in the online setting, I do think that there's some positive to having that. It is getting information out there to people. It is giving people another avenue to look for help, and offering spiritual care. As far as, you know, getting information that is trying to dispel the stigma about seeking help for issues, I think it's a double-edged sword. One, it either makes people too neurotic because they're getting too much information and they're relying on solely what they read on the internet or what information they're gathering. Like, you know, you have those people who are stuck on WebMD. So I think too much information is a problem, and people relying solely on this tool that gives you all this information versus seeking the professional help and the professional care of people who have credentials. I think that is where it's a double-edged sword. Yes, giving people more access to information and even services, but encouraging people to use it correctly is, to me, the thing that may be missing. So you may want to start advertising that you give spiritual direction online, but at the same point, I feel like I try to encourage my students to come see me, you know, to have coffee, so that there is some personal interaction and not to rely on that heavily. I remind my students that it's important to have relationships, to have spiritual friendships even. So it's a line that we have to find balance. Anyone else? All right. That kind of wraps up what I have to offer.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all. Thank you all. Some of us will be around for questions and conversations after, for those in the room and on our web. We have a break between now and 1:30. We will pick up again. We will reconvene. The website to log into that, if you're not going to be present physically, is live.eformationvts.org. And that will pick up again at 1:30 downstairs in our chapel. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.